All right, we're back once again, and we're going to change gears just a little bit here. And I'm joined by my colleague, Mike Colino, and we're going to talk about how to choose the right container orchestration platform. So we'll dive right into it here with some quick introductions. Once again, my name is Tim Curlis. I'm the Chief Architect for DevOps at Ahead. And for this presentation, I'll be playing the role of the operator, caring about running these applications as best as I possibly can for our customers and the satisfaction of the business. Mike?
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. Again, my name is Mike Colino. I'm the Chief Architect of our Modern Applications practice at Ahead. I'll dive right into starting with our agenda for today, Tim. What we want to talk about in this conversation, as I sort of represent the development side of the house to sort of complement your focus on operations, is to talk about containers in the enterprise, how mature and successful enterprises are running containers today at scale, some of the primary considerations I know is something that you're going to go through, and then we'll briefly touch on some of the common pitfalls and oversights that we see customers sort of stub their toes on and hopefully ward them off of making similar mistakes. And then lastly, we'll simplify the journey and I'll talk about, how do we merge a bit more cautiously in organizations, step a little bit more gingerly towards containers if it seems like a daunting task for them. Tim, do you want to talk about sort of the impetus of containers? And I know you've got a deep background in infrastructure and VMs, and just kind of talk about the changing landscape of the world as we see it today.
Yeah, I come from a long line of virtualization engineering hours, and certainly back in the mid 2000s, 2005, 2006, we started looking at these things called virtual machines, and all of our servers were physical, and it was very difficult and timely, costly and ineffective use of our time to provision these. So virtual machines really presented a much faster way and a very big paradigm shift. And really containers are doing that, but even more so on a whole new level. And you can see here from the graph, the number of VMs really scaled linearly with the number of servers, but containers is really scheduled in a much more aggressive fashion, especially in the last few years, as they represent a much more modular way to deploy your code and obviously package and ship your code as well. So the importance of this, how we pick these platforms and how we do this at scale in our enterprise is really driven by the fact that there's this need to run our applications in containers, and will continue to be that need, both to run and to support these containers. So that's the main theme for this presentation.
What seems the most daunting, Tim, from your standpoint of talking about how VMs sort of scaled linearly with the machines or the sort of being the primary constructs of what we deployed software to or ran workloads on? Contrast that sort of mindset with the sort of container world that we're in today.
Yeah, when we went to virtual machines, it was still every server was a server, and we had to care about its life cycle. It came into life and being and lasted 5 or 7 years, and we had to install an OS and then patch that throughout its life cycle. And for many of us, the deployment of the application was simply just laying down the new code every time it came about, and it just got crustier and crustier over time. But each of these had to be maintained and managed as a single thing. So as much as we cared about running applications well in production, it was sort of at the mercy of this paradigm and having to operate, more and more of the scale, meaning more and more of our own cycles. And I know there were similar difficulties and complications on the developer side. So, Mike, what are you looking at as a big difference moving from virtual machines and servers as pets to more of the containerized and cattle approach?
Yeah, good question. We highlight sort of the Windows Server considerations here, and we use that just based off of my background, and that's sort of the development environment that I sort of came up through. That said, the sort of Java sort of open source, more sort of open ecosystem. The considerations and sort of the shift is no different if you're running sort of variations of or distributions of Linux as well. But I think I look at back in the day, one, the considerations that the developer had to familiarize themselves with in terms of all things associated with configuration and running of dependencies in order to make your application run. I typically now sort of look back as well on we have these sort of container platforms to support a more distributed application architecture. And so I now look back and sort of associate the VM-based model with more of a sort of monolithic application where vertical scaling was sort of a primary consideration, as opposed to today we see much more of a horizontal scaling approach. And I think the other thing enabled by benefit provided by container platforms is this sort of complementary continuous delivery, continuous deployment model. In contrast to, again, in the VM days, we were ecstatic about continuous integration when it came online, the fact that we had it. But again, because there was such a larger scope of consideration with VMs, I don't know how possible that would be in terms of some of the ideals that we're after today, which are continuous delivery, continuous deployment.
Yeah, and I think for many organizations, continuous integration and building is almost table stakes at this point, but deployments are still very hard. It's very manual, and there's a large difficulty around automating that process because all of these servers are so unique and so almost fragile over the life cycle. But don't just take our word for it. We did some research. Let's look at what the enterprises say are some top priorities from a movement perspective.
Yeah, and we ran this study roughly around 8 or 9 months ago, so right at the beginning of 2020. And I think if you would have asked him what our sort of projected priorities would be, sort of anticipating the results of the survey, they'd fall very much in line with the information that we received back from our customers, right? Which is they need to meet the needs of their business partners and ultimately their downstream customers faster than they have before. And this isn't just a speed play. I find it very interesting, yet not surprising, that quality, it's essentially the same statement or the same priority as the first one, but there's an emphasis on quality software. So this isn't saying, rush to the finish line and throw a bunch of cobbled together code that isn't tested well or doesn't have a high degree of quality. It's deliver faster in order to meet our needs, but also do it with a level of quality that we haven't seen before. And so that, along with the fact that Tim talked about automation before, we're dealing with a different size and scale as we saw to that container graph. We're identifying a new sort of paradigm here where the scale is just infinitely larger, and so automation just becomes that much more important. And so, if we kind of look at these priorities and then we go to contrast it with, or I should say, marry it up with what Tim and I speak to our customers about all the time, which is this combination of the modern applications practice that I lead on the head side, and Tim with the DevOps leadership that he provides on the DevOps side. This combination allows our customers to essentially achieve those priorities. And ultimately, as we'll see in terms of the considerations, containers is a part of that story. So I'll just kind of walk through sort of these pain points or these opportunities that our customers have to meet those priorities, to meet the needs of the business and customers faster by pivoting to some of these new sort of paradigms and ideals. The first is, moving away from that incremental monolithic design, again, sort of that server-based, or I should say VM-based, almost application architecture, and moving away from that to more of a distributed model, which obviously in distributed architecture, which containers lends itself very well to supporting. As organizations look to decompose those monolithic applications that run their business into distributed cloud native applications, they're also looking for the opportunity to instrument not only continuous integration, but when we say continuous integration and continuous delivery, we're also talking about giving themselves the confidence through the ability to run a set of automated regression tests, commit by commit, merge by merge into the code repositories that over time they're building up a safety net of regression tests so that one, they don't have to go out and essentially continue to scale the number of people inside of these testing pools in order to ensure that they haven't broken any core functionality as they look to rapidly release new functionality into production. So moving away from sort of arduous regression, arduous deployment, that idea of every time we make a change, we have to redeploy the entire application. We have to do so by also instrumenting, an entire build and deploy process, which requires, numerous cycles of regression testing and numerous cycles of, manual intervention in our deployment process. We want to move towards test-driven development, and again, that sort of CI/CD pipeline from commit all the way out to deployed out to production. The other two sort of key areas of opportunity for our customers is transitioning away from that traditional divide that has existed between development and operations. It's very much key in terms of the sort of culture and the process side of what Tim and his team are intricately focused on in terms of a new DevOps model. That said, it's best instrumented based off of Tim and my experience and what we preach to customers in the context of application initiatives that you're going after. In many cases, it's about modernizing applications or building greenfield, brand new cloud native applications. And then lastly, the last consideration, which is sort of front and center here, is the idea of we get out of the paradigm of wrestling enterprise infrastructure, sort of server by server, maintaining those over time, and being responsible for that lifecycle management, as Tim stated. And we move to more cloud native platforms where containers are first class citizens, and the lifecycle is completely different. So, those are the things that obviously Tim and I are talking to our customers about. As it relates to the items here, you can make the sort of parallel and draw the path back to how and where container platforms are key to either directly or indirectly sort of holding up these in supporting these new practices. Tim, do you want to talk about sort of, as the world sort of changes and evolves, and we're sort of spotlighting it here a little bit in terms of the fact that our two practices work together, but the world from what application developers need to consider as well as IT operators need to consider and be aware of, those worlds are coalescing and coming together as well.
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, and it comes out mostly in the fact that we're just forced to run a greater and greater number of these smaller applications and more business-centric applications. And the model that we use to support that needs to change, or something else will give. So some of the top challenges that enterprise are facing, as I just said, legacy software is very inflexible. As mergers and acquisitions happen and growth, applications become more and more challenging to rationalize and perhaps more duplicative. In addition to that, the cultural and process side of the current IT environments are just taking too much time. The test and release process takes too long, as we can see here. And there's just this overall slowdown with respect to the communication and the process for which or that people use to kind of collaborate and work together. And the infrastructure just can't keep up. And I think that's one of the main themes from all of these kind of options that you see here. But really, this all translates into this need to go faster. And I think the platform is at the bottom of that, and it works up from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we touched on the fact that there's this opportunity on the operations side. There's an opportunity on the application development side. We talked about these sort of worlds coming together. So maybe kind of leading us off from a operations standpoint, I know that you, even in your conversations with IT operations teams, you're looking at identifying ways to sort of educate them on what application development looks like, and what are some of the traditional pain points. But can you talk about, as these worlds sort of come together, what some of the new IT operations considerations are?
Yeah, absolutely. And the word I know you like in this case is empathy, which is a great word. And really, what that comes down to is as an operator, I've got things that I care about in terms of keeping the business running, making sure everyone's happy, and making sure that I have a balance in my life as well. And that is running the hardware, the physical platforms, the virtual infrastructure, and the container infrastructure, and having the necessary automation to keep all of that running. But I think in the past, a lot of times that's where it all ended, and the development teams kind of throw stuff over the wall, and we get it, running hopefully on the server, and that line is much more static and much more hard to sort of jump over in the past. And I think that's where the empathy comes in. Just because the things on the bottom are the stuff that I care about doesn't mean I shouldn't have an interest and understanding as to what the development team is doing, and how that is helping the business and how their world kind of collides with my own. And that's where that cultural increase in communication and team structure paradigm needs to come out.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say it's the same over on the application development side. As you stated, the throwing code over the wall to the operations team, the number of cycles that were sort of burned there and that continue to burn inside of large organizations, again, is a large impediment to slowing those particular teams down. That said, I think the sort of common currency now is the container, and it levels the playing field and also sort of creates the construct for application developers and operators to be able to speak sort of the same language. That, along with the fact that in many cases, the sort of operational plan associated with orchestrating these containers has to be a sort of a bimodal communication because of the fact that we've got a common language, the intricacies and the specifics of what's in the container and how it should be run. That needs to come from the development team, as well as the limitations associated with the platform and all the other operational considerations. That needs to be relayed from the IT operations team back to the development team. So we're obviously moving into a new world where, as we state here, worlds are colliding. But again, the process and the sort of enhanced culture where we're building sort of empathy, as well as having conversations based off of the fact that we've got this common language and familiar constructs to use, is providing an opportunity to collaborate in ways that we haven't seen traditionally between development and operations. So I think it's exciting. So Tim, you want to come
the common language, I think in this case, is the code, and that is the opportunity to collaborate. And I don't just mean the application code. It's the fact that all of the things you see here with respect to the automation, the containers themselves, I mean, all of that is defined as code now. And it's certainly in the operator world, it's forcing us to take a more keen interest in all of the things that maybe developers have come to know and love in terms of trunk-based development and GitOps and the ability to collaborate with some of those tools. And I think it just widens that collaboration envelope so that, it's no longer about here, take this application and run it. It's, we're collaborating on the code front to build it in the best possible container and run the best possible tests against it, both in terms of the application and the infrastructure it runs on, and really automate the full release process through nothing more than a bunch of YAML files, today anyway. So I agree. I think the common language is really important.
Yeah. So let's again, we sort of started here. We'll just kind of relay and iterate this again. Is this is the world that we know, and obviously we're moving to a world where we'll finish, where containers will be first. Can you highlight sort of again the sort of summary of not only all the things, because in many cases organizations aren't necessarily making this change overnight. It is more of a sort of slow progression. That in turn leads us to sort of a multi-state world in terms of VMs and containers. But can you kind of talk about and summarize the sort of totality of both VMs and containers from an operation or from an operator standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's one thing I've learned through the process is it's hard. Containers are hard, and it comes with any new technology, and that it's kind of a given that you just have to work through and gain some experience on. But I think in terms of helping that process along, not going it alone, having a plan, because operating these platforms, you're still maintaining servers at some point underneath all of that. And there's a whole lifecycle aspect that oftentimes gets overlooked. How do I get these clusters stood up and manage them? How do I operate them? Certainly the day two, right, and the long-term operations are even more important than just standing them up. But then even things like network and storage, these are all concepts that have been changing rapidly, but are even compounded by how much they overlay on top of the platforms. So it really helps to have this plan and to sort of, as we'll see in a few slides here, kind of go through the process and understand your needs and how it relates to the tools out there.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say the same on the development side. Organizations will kind of stair step their way into containers, and there's a natural progression of a handful of teams sort of get initial exposure, and ultimately there's a sort of a rolling out of sort of lessons learned inside of the organization, new sort of greenfield opportunities start up. That isn't to say that those same teams don't have responsibilities for carrying and feeding for legacy applications that are deployed to VM. So we'll end up finishing for a lot of these organizations that we work with in kind of a two-state system, but it is interesting to see the fact that all of these, as you stated, paradigms are changing, not only on the platform side, but on the network and security side, on the application architecture side, and there's a lot of consideration. So I'll hand it over to you because I know that you're planning on talking about sort of the key imperatives and ideals to sort of look at and look for as you're weighing container platform decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go through four primary considerations from the strategy and then into the architecture. And as I mentioned, just that all important aspect of operating these things. And then finish up with what I like to call unicorns, which really just is specifics about your business and how that impacts the choice. So we're gonna dive in and start here with strategy, and really the strategy is how you start. And it's I would say one of the first challenges comes up is you're foraying into something very new, and it's tempting to sort of just get your feet wet by spinning something up somewhere. And experimentation is good. But when you lock into something without the strategy, that's where we've seen customers in the past then have to go through arduous migration cycles. They've had pockets of difficult to support infrastructure and systems. So the strategy is all about looking at avoiding kind of that sprawl and shadow IT, and instead of slowing innovation, taking a little bit of a pause, 8 weeks, whatever, and really using that time to make it so that you'll go much faster afterward, right? So it's important from a predictable development cycles perspective. It's helps you, have the agility to respond to customers more quickly, and really to support more work streams in the long run by sort of taking a pause and looking at that strategy. And what that really means is, what are our use cases? Are we doing a lot of off-the-shelf integration? Are we doing a lot more custom app developments? Do we have a lot of .NET framework stuff that we need to worry about getting to .NET Core? All of these factors, in addition to kind of the process and the way you interact with security and network and load balancing and architecture, these are all things that drive some of these strategy considerations that need to be taken into account and looked at upfront before any sort of decisions or investments are made. So this is important. It doesn't have to take a long time, but it's good to get everyone in the room together and really talk about what these aspects are and sort of get them down on paper and identify how the platforms in the marketplace can help address and improve some of these.
Tim, I always think it's funny from my standpoint to someone who's typically requested on the application development side things over the years from enterprise IT, and in some cases you have very guarded enterprise IT and infrastructure teams who are very diligent about sort of thinking through and putting up the controls so that developers don't go off the rails. At the same time, I see the same sort of organizations who have that sort of posture, very quickly stand up, container orchestration platform and put a mission critical enterprise workload on it without sort of this strategy. So I think it's really imperative, as you stated, to identify the use cases and to really spend the time, no different as they would in terms of wrapping the right controls around any sort of provisioning process inside of traditional enterprise IT, no different from containers here in the future.
Yeah, I mean, look, we know how much effort goes into the planning and design of the application we're talking about, and so why not spend even a little bit of time, understanding and planning for the strategy for what runs that application underneath it. So absolutely, it's really important.
Yeah.
Just as important, though, is the architecture itself, and on the surface, things can look very similar, and it's hard to sometimes differentiate. Is solution A better than solution B? Should I look at this one over here? And I think, understanding, going back to the strategy, the use cases that you have will help to separate different solutions from the pack there. And so it's really important to bring in not just the application team and what they need, but also the networking team and the operations and the storage team, the infrastructure folks, the security folks. That's a big one, is often overlooked. And the application development team, just to make sure that everyone's use cases and their success factors are really met here. So, an example, if the network team is really down the path with software-defined networking, and they're doing a lot of microsegmentation and looking towards the future of how they secure the network, sometimes throwing in a container orchestration platform, Kubernetes, can make a very large black box that, if they're not in the picture, can at the best sort of duplicate their efforts. At the worst, it can expose the business to unnecessary risk. So these are all really important things, making sure that there's feature consideration for the teams that need those. And again, it just goes to that ensuring that clean integration with the existing systems. So the existing systems could be old legacy type stuff, but it could also just be new efforts. Security team is doing more with software analysis and dynamic analysis, and getting a solution that doesn't sort of meet that in the middle can then stymie and slow things down, and again create this sort of black box that isn't affected or scanned by some of those things. So we need to track those requirements. We need to understand the decisions prior to making them and investing in them. And this is important because this is it's the day one, but it's the robust foundation going forward into day 2 through N. And it's really central to the core enterprise capabilities and really achieving the operational readiness, so that you're not left, somebody leaves the organization, for example, and then this platform can no longer be supported. We need to consider how we train people, how do we create a center or a community of excellence around this, and what are the procedures we have that really keep us, growing with this into the future.
Yeah, and I'll just add there. The day 2 piece is significant in terms of considerations. Andrew Clay Schaefer, who's a DevOps advocate, says it best that day 1 is adorable, day 2 is forever, right? And so there's a lot of momentum and excitement around building these platforms, embracing this new innovation. But similar to the strategy consideration, I think this dovetails right on top of it, which is the idea inside of most organizations is to embrace this technology in order to better satisfy the needs of the business. And in doing so, there needs to be a considerable amount of forethought given to being able to not only stand this up, but instrument it and get it ready for day 2.
And again, we're not talking about taking a year to figure this out. We want to figure it out in steps so that we can get going quickly. But the worst thing you can do is have one small team go off and do something, not consult the rest of the business, not take just a few weeks to sort of pause and say, why is this important? And how do we make sure everyone at least can get what they want out of it now or in the future. And those are the things that, it needs to be done in order to ensure the success going forward. So great points.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other maybe tip there is, if you're going out and trying to put the controls around any sort of other provisioning process or any other sort of planning process, at the very least, it's the same level of due diligence. It's the not rushing to stand something up or not enlisting one team to kind of go off on its own. I think just doing what enterprise IT and infrastructure teams are traditionally used to doing when it comes to planning large initiatives, that's the same level of care that they should take when instrumenting a strategy like this.
Absolutely. And I love the Andrew Clay Schaefer quote because, again, the architecture is one thing, but operations we have to live with. And again, containers are hard. They are going to take some learning, just like it did, to run distributed systems and virtual machines. But they're ephemeral by design, right? And that makes the operations immediately more challenging. You can't always log in with root and understand a log file of what's going on. You have to plan for that log to be sent somewhere that gets integrated into this more automated design of catching mistakes and even self-healing. And what we've really found is Kubernetes becomes this black box when operated in silos, and that is inclusive of operations as well. So if a team of 4 people go off and spin up a Kubernetes cluster, when there are challenges, if somebody leaves or something goes down, it's not like you can go to somewhere else in the business and ask for help because there's no center or community of excellence. There's no process of education, and there's no set of standards around monitoring and logging and keeping this thing running. So it may seem faster to quickly grab something off the shelf and get your project moving, but in the long run, you'll do yourself a much greater disservice because it'll become very challenging if something goes wrong, and it will, right? We know it will. And so tracking a system that changes frequently like these do is very difficult, right? And so that's the importance of understanding your specific operational challenges as well as the typical ones, and understanding how the solutions that come into play can actually address some of those things. And again, the poor experience really can taint the whole outlook of this platform going forward. So, getting buy-in is much easier when you have a plan and when it goes smoothly and starts to build that confidence going forward. And I don't know, Mike, if there's anything on the application side that, I just think of the applications teams getting so frustrated with the platforms that run their applications. And to me, you don't have time to support them, don't want to support them. You want an operations team that can do that efficiently.
Yeah. And again, to a certain standpoint, the development teams are new to this as well. There's a lot of power to being able to build distributed applications, to flexibility to sort of scale certain components up and scale certain components down. That said, there needs to be a complementary set of considerations and a complementary dialogue as to highlight if and when applications fail, what are the application patterns and practices that are in place, but also what are the satellite tools that we can, both as operations and application development teams, use. What's the cohesive strategy there so that when things go wrong, we can work collaboratively together as opposed to, again, sort of that sort of traditional siloed model that we see inside of a lot of organizations. So completely agree here.
Absolutely. And last here, this is pretty quick. It's the unicorns, right? And the fact is your business has unique requirements, and no amount of industry rating rankings and assessments is really going to address those. So you have to look at those for yourself and figure out how they integrate into the framework that you're looking at for these solutions. So maybe you're in healthcare and you have to worry about HIPAA, or you're in energy and you have to worry about NERC and SIP. Maybe you're in retail or banking and you have need to run some of these solutions in branches or retail locations. Maybe you have a strong mix of commercial off-the-shelf software and custom apps. So all of these things are very unique to your business, and they need to be incorporated. And I mean, that really brings us to the crux of this whole thing, where we want to take all of these things, the strategy, the architecture, the operations, and the unicorns, and we want to build this into a scorecard. And there's a number of reasons for doing this. It allows us, A, to fairly rank and stack these solutions. B, it allows us to weight these rankings such that things that are more critical to business A, less critical to business B, are then taken into consideration with respect to the score itself. And ultimately, where we found some really big success here is it provides our stakeholders with this factual data about the decisions we've made. We're not just relying on the vendor to provide something. We're saying, let's take that information and let's verify it, and also incorporate our own unicorns into that. So this is a very important process as part of the upfront strategy to kind of generate this scorecard and help us make this selection going forward.
I always think it's interesting, Tim, when we walk customers through things like this. I think you're right. It takes a bit of the art out of the decision-making process in terms of choosing a container. It forces a lot of conversations between folks who typically don't interact, whether it be operations and infrastructure, as well as the security teams, or again, more the traditional operations versus application development teams. This is a really good way of surfacing the right questions to ask, as well as to create a dialogue that, as it relates to other software and hardware purchases of the past, I wouldn't be surprised if those conversations weren't had. And ultimately, it was one or two key decision makers who, along with a list of assumptions, went ahead with those purchases. So I think this is a great exercise, and we've seen a lot of beneficial conversations with our customers when we walk them through these as part of the workshops that you and your team run.
Absolutely.
So maybe highlighting not only the primary considerations as you have here, Tim, also stressing the importance of, again, taking that sort of art of the sort of decisioning associated with container platforms out of the mix. I think it's also important to sort of highlight the mistakes that we see customers make time and time again, and equally stress not to leave these other considerations or these other important elements sitting on the sideline, to incorporate them into the sort of science of making the decision as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're saying is this is not fine. and you're right. I mean, we've, in all seriousness, we've seen a pattern emerge, and it's not the fault of any of these customers. It's just, again, containers are hard, and it's easy to sort of overlook some of these things. So we hope by kind of bringing these up that will draw your attention to some of them. First is, none of the platforms we've really looked at have a deep focus on security, and it's not a fault. It's more by design. Kubernetes is by design very pluggable, and so one of the plugs that we think everyone needs to consider is the security plug. And a few of the top platforms out there we see a lot and work with would be Aqua, Prisma from Palo Alto, and then Sysdig. And it's just, these orchestration platforms don't provide the full security required. You can create network policies, but what is, and I like to think of it as kind of the three pieces of this being, consider that developer workflow. So what types of containers can the developers pull into the process, and then knowing that once they pull them in, sometimes they stick, and not wanting some of that source stuff to be dangerous or perhaps from the wrong source. So, and secondly, control what images get run. We want to scan images as they get built. That's a very table stakes thing. And then lastly, just, notifications and remediations plugging into kind of the existing security process. So not only, vulnerabilities that exist in the registry, but also in the kernel and in the running space of these applications. If anything is not wrong now, but becomes wrong in the future, what is the system there that can at least notify and hopefully even automatically remediate some of these issues? And that, again, is drawn up by the greater emphasis on automation as you mature.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that, Tim, is, we talk about the fact, and we see it firsthand, that organizations don't have this as sort of a front and center consideration, yet you could go back to your primary considerations and really use security as sort of the common thread amongst all of those, right? In terms of not only the unique security requirements of an organization, the vertical that it's in, but how are we strategizing, architecturally planning, and ensuring that we're secure from an operations standpoint. You think that would be just front and center as it relates to all the places where customers are thinking about, what are the factors that I need to consider as part of a container strategy. But in many cases, it is something that tends to fall a bit by the wayside. And, subsequently, that's not what you ask CIOs and CTOs and CISOs. They're going to be shocked if they find out that isn't something that was considered when purchasing a product.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of takes us to the next and the second one of these pitfalls, which is the idea of making progress slowly. And what I mean by that is, and we've seen it go both ways. You could have a group that just wants Docker containers. Suddenly they wind up with a half a dozen or a dozen individual hosts running Docker containers with no orchestration, no HA, no ability to recover from any sort of failures, not to mention no integration with network, storage, security, et cetera. And so you want to sort of take a pause and consider these things that we've talked about. But at the same time, you don't want to stop everything dead and make it so nobody can innovate. So there's a balance. There's, I think the another Andrew Clay Schaefer quote, right, Mike, is the big bang, all you get is a big bang, right? So what we really want to see is what's the minimally viable product that we can start with, something that hopefully takes weeks to maybe a few months, not years. And then what are the steps after that to add functionality to that? So it's part of creating the roadmap is also creating this sort of stepwise plan within each piece of the roadmap.
Yeah, and I make the same sort of corollary recommendation on the application development side, Tim, and that there's a pragmatic, delicate balance that needs to be considered when going to modernize applications. And obviously, as part of that modernization plan, there's a sort of container-based or distributed sort of application abstraction piece and component to that, as well as relates to running your application on infrastructure. And I couldn't agree more. I think many of which, again, this comes back to the considerations that you highlighted earlier. What are the needs of the organization? What are the constraints associated or specific to my organization? And how do I, again, sort of stair-step my way there is important. That said, again, we do see the analysis paralysis in certain cases, but in other cases, more prominently, as you stated, it's let's go stand up a cluster of containers over here, and then 6 months from now we got 4 or 5 mission critical apps or workloads running on it, and trying to figure out how do we scale this, how do we update it, how do we maintain it. So there's that sort of Goldilocks path there that ultimately organizations need to follow.
Yeah, Goldilocks is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So why don't we talk about getting started here slowly and merging into this container first world?
Yeah. Again, it's some organizations are going to be able to dive into this head first, based off of the operational talent that they have, or how quickly the application team can enable the operations team to embrace this model, or vice versa. But there are a lot of tools out there today that make this process of moving away from VMs to containers a lot simpler and a great sort of starting points. And so wanted to just kind of highlight those today, especially as we lay out the considerations, identify the pitfalls. Let's also talk about, where are some of the easy buttons that are out there for enterprises to push. One of them is Cloud Native Build Packs. Cloud Native Build Packs today is a sandbox project in the CNCF. Originally came out of Heroku, now has been obviously with CNCF. Sort of adoption has become a much more known project, and we see a lot of not only organizations but platforms embracing the Cloud Native Build Pack model. And so the idea behind Cloud Native Build Packs is if I'm an application developer rather than saddling them in this new world of having to construct their own container images, we can use what are called builder images. And builder images are provided by, out of the box, by organizations like Heroku, organizations like Google, where we can essentially provide the builder or the build pack engine our source code. And from there, it can derive all the dependencies that are needed in the container and build all the appropriate layers inside of the container image. So essentially an offloading and abstraction away of saddling developers with having to build their own containers. What's nice about this is that it isn't only exclusive to the builders that are provided to us. We can, based off of, again, the unicorns that are in our organization, the requirements that we have, the security specifications, we have the ability to control the what's ultimately going into those container images once they're built by the application developers, as well as to ensure that any sort of compliance metrics or compliance aspects are incorporated as well. So we can create custom builders that ultimately the development teams can use and subsequently not only use to build up front, but one of the really interesting and compelling aspects of cloud native build packs is we also have the ability to swap layers of the image out over time by simply rebasing the image. So if you think about a situation where we use a cloud native build pack to build our initial application image, and it has a set of dependencies, and those dependencies are baked in as we see on the left-hand side here. Let's assume that the BP2 layer is a library, that open source library that we're using that has a known vulnerability that has been identified. We can rebase our image, and through both the aspects and areas of the image that haven't been updated, as well as the ability to go out and essentially just swap that one particular layer of the image out. This provides us sort of day two sort of operational, not only consistency, but ease of use from a development standpoint. We don't have to go back and rebaseline or rebuild that image from scratch. So build packs are very, very developer friendly. And again, it can be used both on the operational side and on the compliance side to ensure that all aspects of what we want packaged into the containers that we're running are enforced by creating custom builders at the enterprise level. One of the other important aspects as we transition away from this sort of VM-based world, and again, you talked about sort of the ability to sort of log in as root, or in the Microsoft Windows Server side, we have the ability to remote desktop into a particular server image that our applications are running on. One of the big leaps is this idea of, because of their ephemeral nature, really not having the ability to sort of visualize containers in Kubernetes, for example. So one of the projects that I love came from Brian Lyles and a bunch of folks over at VMware, is the open source project Octant, where we essentially have the ability, it's an open source project that provides this really nice GUI that gives us sort of this operational control center, if you will, to sort of visualize Kubernetes. So again, these are the types of tools that organizations can use, in some of the early days of, helping both operators and developers understand and use Kubernetes. And again, this is also to sort of ease that transition as we move away from sort of a VM-based world into a world where maybe not on day one, but sooner rather than later, containers will be the primary focus from an application development and an operations standpoint.
Yeah, right. I think that underscores the need for just open source. And I think, when you go with one of these solutions, you may go with Red Hat OpenShift, you may go with VMware Tanzu. But at the end of the day, there's all these open source projects that can be incorporated in addition to those. So it's, as much as picking the platform is important, it's also important to understand your ecosystem needs. We've all seen the CNCF landscape, crazy amount of tools on that scorecard or that landscape. But the trick is to understand what your needs are first, and then if you have something that fills that already, and if you don't, then you can bring something in. And I think the open source community provides a lot of really creative ways to address some of these. Build packs and Octane are two great examples.
Yeah. Tim, do you want to wrap up here in terms of just all the things that we've gone through today? I know we've talked through a lot, but really appreciated sort of being part of this conversation with you today. And obviously your team is so much front and center working with our customers today who are really at this sort of key and pivotal sort of decision point inside their organization. So.
Yeah, likewise, enjoyed it. And as you like to say, it's the peanut butter and jelly conversation, because you can't honestly have one of these without the other. And, so I think it's important, once again, to have a strategy up front that brings in your unique architecture requirements, and also looks at really the operating model going forward, and certainly takes into account what we call your unicorns, your business and organizational specific aspects that will impact this decision. And it's important to take all of these aspects and bring them into the scorecard to help understand the priorities and the trade-offs, and really, bring that all together into your decision.
Yeah, and I think the other nice thing that we provide at Ahead, and not to say that we're exclusive in doing it, but you're always going to get a vendor perspective, especially as you're going to identify which of the container platforms suit your organization best in terms of your requirements and your needs. But you have the ability to leverage, for example, us here at Ahead to kind of go through the sort of scorecarding process, identify the tools that are out there, identify the decisions that need to be made, as well as you stated, Tim, exposure and sort of knowledge of some of these open source tools that sort of satellite and revolve around this ecosystem, continues to be an important thing for customers to understand as well.
And again, I think it's just really important to plan, right? And spend some time, but not too much time, so that you're still innovating, but you're doing it in a way that you avoid these rushed decisions that can sometimes cost you a lot more time down the road. So hopefully that has been helpful. And I think with that, we have a little bit of time here just to transition to a bit of a Q&A session. So please go ahead and use the Q&A panel, and Mike and I would love to answer your questions, and we'll take as many as we can in the time left. All right. So we have a number of questions here, so let's just dive in, coming in as we go. The first question is, it looks like around a use case, maybe an HR off-the-shelf type system that's made up of 3 applications. Each application is made up of microservices, and using orchestration to control or bind those microservices, but wanting to bind the 3 applications. Or do I care about orchestration at that level? I think, and then 3 apps to make one HR product. I think that's a paradigm we're seeing more and more of. In fact, Mike, you just did a presentation at VMworld recently, just around how we're decoupling some of these things to get into breaking those down and hosting those applications. And to the earlier question, I think it just helps to have a plan for how you're going to do that, how you're going to support that, and how you're going to piece these things together. And I would, definitely suggest going out and watching. I don't have the link in front of me, but watching Mike's presentation on that.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Tim. This comes up so frequently because there's this, as we talked about this morning, there's this, tendency to want to over-rotate and over-prescribe on some of these patterns. And this is a case where, things are now so loosely coupled that we're finding situations where we want to bring these things together. And I think the immediate, first motion in terms of how do we solve this is, how do we look at, Kubernetes, for example, or the constructs of, sort of binding or orchestration or networking to bring these together. I would say, you're solving a solved problem at that point. I think there are other alternatives where you can use an API management platform or something along those lines to essentially just bring or build composite or aggregator sort of APIs, as opposed to having to create all that stitching and plumbing yourself. So not to say that one is better than the other, and not to say that binding based off of the custom requirements isn't a path you go down. But again, I would reinforce, let's keep our minds open in terms of, if we need to get data from across a set of services, we don't need to go down to the platform or even lower to figure that out. Let's identify what's the right tool for the job.
Okay, another question here.
I was just going to say, go ahead.
So most organizations cannot start greenfield, meaning that we have both legacy VMs and net new containers. How do you keep focus while running the business while modernizing, I like the last word, safely? Maybe I'll take that one quick, and then you can chime in, Mike.
Sure.
I think safely is the key word there. I think as you build the kind of use cases, if you have a large application portfolio, I don't think it hurts to do some app analysis and figure out what you want to move first and modernize first and in what order. I also think in figuring out what those triggers are for safety, what represents a loss of safety for us. Is it downtime, and how do we address downtime? How fast is that? And I think these are things that need to be answered before you undertake, some of these things. And, from there, I think there are solutions. Like, again, goes back to the scorecarding process. But if you look at like vSphere 7 with Tanzu from VMware, the ability to run VMs and containers side by side and actually have that infrastructure persona that I'm very familiar with continue to leverage vCenter, for example. That's a really significant way to manage both solutions and make the process a lot easier to deal with. And there are other solutions like that, but I think it has to be the key with how you weight that in your scorecard.
Yeah, I agree, Tim. I think the other thing that I heard this morning was in Dave Bartoletti's talk, a similar question came up in the Q&A, and he talked about how, and this isn't possible for every single application in your portfolio, but a good place to start, especially as you're sort of weighing whether or not modernization makes sense, is to just containerize the application that you have. And you get the benefits associated with that, aside from even having into loosely coupled microservices. So I think containerization is a great place to start. It provides some benefits, especially in the enterprise space, where we see a lot of organizations struggling, which is keeping environments pieces. And plus, how realistic is it to assume, and how challenging is it going to be for us to modernize? So that's that's just something that's important in terms of a consideration and maybe a first step for folks.
Absolutely. Another question here, just more tactically, from what you've seen, how effective has Splunk been in accommodating security logging piece in the world of containers? I think it's actually a great question, because it brings up an example that applies to a lot of paradigms: load balancing, networking, storage. Right? Just the way Kubernetes is designed is very much your batteries not included paradigm. So everything's kind of an API connector, and what we need to think about, at least in the case of logging, is that containers are ephemeral, and if you have logs that get sent to storage, they need to be sent off. And I think Splunk has been a pretty great platform that we've seen in terms of aggregating those logs. Almost the bigger thing to me, and Mike, you probably see this, is making sure your application developers and the teams and the infrastructure folks are logging. Right? If you're not actually logging the stuff that's important and sending it to these sort of standard, output areas and mechanism, it becomes infinitely more difficult to come up with that solid logging strategy, and more likely that things are going to get lost.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a new paradigm as well for the product vendors, and Splunk no different, right? So they're moving from a traditional sort of VM install base to one that's embracing containers more and more every day. That, along with the fact that these platforms, namely Kubernetes, are extendable, which creates a ton of competition for the Splunks of the world, right? In terms of what Tim just alluded to in the talk, the CNCF sort of product landscape or project landscape map is massive, and so there's very purpose built tooling to the, in some cases, the letter of individual use cases or uses of the platform, that again, depending on your use case, or your specific needs, maybe moving away from Splunk and adopting one of those projects is worth the sort of swap out and upskilling and retooling that would be required. But I'm also with Tim. There's a bunch of low-hanging fruit that typically gets missed inside of large organizations around, again, whether it's app modernization, whether it's container first sort of enablement, and initiation. There's a lot of just standard logging that is really sort of the first step. And again, that's where you're not going to see that level of differentiation versus a Splunk or another tool. So yeah, I think you articulated that well, Tim.
All right. Another question here for governance compliance. Have you seen some successful implementations leveraging an artifact metadata store, such as Google's Grapheus, across overall DevOps process? What implementation versions worked well, and which ones not so well? I think this space of artifacts and container registries has been very fluid, and I think it's been actually an area that organizations have in some cases overlooked, and we see this all the time. I think it dovetails also into the process of pruning images, right? And which helps with security because you have fewer images to worry about, and obviously helps keep storage down as well. But I would say in answer to the question, there's certainly, I actually think the majority of organizations have yet to solve kind of that issue, and maybe isn't a key thing for them right now. I think in other cases, tools, actually Aqua, one that comes to my mind that does auditing, quite well. Back to the slide around security, and some of those security tools, going more the enterprise route has helped some organizations. And some of the other ones that do have an emphasis in open source have also looked at things like Grapheus and similar approaches where they have kind of custom processes using those tools to get the data they want. But whichever of those you sort of fall into, I think the biggest thing is that then tells me it's one of your key considerations for your scorecard. And something like the logging and the registry processes and operating those should be weighted much more highly compared to maybe some of the other organizations, and then that should affect how you score your choices and how you go through with your overall implementation.
Yeah, I'd piggyback on that, Tim. I'd say the container or the artifact space has been very fluid, and I think this is one of those sort of age-old problems that we see inside of enterprise applications and infrastructure, where because of the fluidity, because you've got very new technologies, teams running in different directions, this is basically a standards API. So the question then becomes, how well can you get the different teams across your organizations to adopt a standard? I think the technology here is the easy piece. This is more about sort of orchestrating a standard across your organization. So, Tim, any time or I should say, any other questions come in, or is that it?
I think we have time for one more quick one here. These have been great questions, but getting a little long on time. So we'll take one last one here. Our company sticks to ECS and Fargate. In AWS, should we approach third-party monitoring solutions like Aptly or Datadog, or use CloudWatch and the provided stuff within AWS? Again, it's very in terms of Kubernetes, it doesn't care. So it kind of comes down to what does your enterprise use today? What are you getting or failing to get from those solutions? And do you have kind of a gap there? So again, I think it's important to sort of look at it as in the strategy piece. It's I hate to give the it depends answer, but it really does come down to kind of what you need to get out of that and what you're getting today.
Agreed, Tim. I think, depending on what you have in place, depending on, whether on-premise, having different solution there, assuming you've got an on-prem infrastructure as well as some sort of elaborate sort of hybrid architecture and infrastructure. Those are major questions. But that said, if you're going all in on AWS, I mean, you're trying to take as many advantage of as many services as possible. That it makes sense to sort of streamline there under whatever AWS can provide. All right, sounds good. All right, at this point, wanted to thank everyone. Thanks so much, Tim. Thank you to the team for letting us put this talk together. Again, this is based off of a lot of questions that come up quite frequently from our customers. So hopefully the talking points and the recommendations that we made here today help you choose the right orchestration platform moving forward. At this point, we'll turn it over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And also thanks to you, Tim. And thank you all for joining us as we wrap up day one. I hope to see you back tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern for day two, which is all about the platforms required to enable modern applications and how to approach those platforms with scale in mind. In tomorrow's missions, we'll talk about the need for a public cloud operating model with infrastructure as code built into that model. We'll introduce you to the AHEAD Automation Hub, and we'll tackle the ever-present issue of security. We'll then wrap up with a great session featuring the IT leadership team from Xcel Energy, one of our valued clients, talking about the role of public cloud in their own transformation journey. So thanks again to our sponsors. We look forward to seeing you or hearing you tomorrow. Take care.